Alex, let's move forward to this question of the Cold War and the peace that we had right after the Cold War, right? And, things were getting better. I grew up in the 1990s in Switzerland, and, things like nuclear annihilation, they were not on my mind or on anyone's mind anymore. And the Soviet Union was gone, and things were going well. The worst thing that happened that was going on was the Yugoslav wars, but it felt so far away and so distant that it took me into my 20s to realize that Yugoslavia was part of Europe. That's how removed it felt. Now, that period is over.
Yeah.
What's responsible for that?
Yes, it is the lost peace. And you're absolutely correct. Now, I actually did grow up through the Cold War. I remember the Cold War. I remember nuclear confrontation. I remember the great tensions that existed at that time. And I remember also the sense of enormous relief and euphoria that we had at the end of the 1980s and at the beginning of the 1990s, and the immense gratitude, by the way, and this is an important point to make, people felt to Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader who'd played an instrumental role in bringing that all about. And the situation in Europe stabilized, and Russia opened up, and one found for the first time that we could actually meet Russians, for example, which inconceivable in the Cold War era. I mean, I never, for the early part of my life, I assumed I would never actually meet a Russian. I mean, that was the kind of world that we lived in. And South Africa also changed. The apartheid system collapsed in South Africa at about the same time. And everything seemed to be coming right, and governments seemed to be working together, and people were meeting. What went wrong is very simple, and I think this is the heart of the problem. Some people in the United States did not see the events of the 1980s and the 1990s as a turn towards peace. What they saw it as, what they understood it to be, was a victory for the United States and for particular policies that it had followed. So they assumed that they'd come out of the Cold War winners, which is why, by the way, I mentioned Gorbachev, because it's important to understand that Gorbachev made certain very difficult and very important decisions and was supported by Russian society ultimately in making those decisions. In other words, the agency of people like Gorbachev and the agency of people like Russia and of other people was discounted. And in the United States, this very dangerous myth grew up that it was the United States that won the Cold War, and that as the victor, it had not just the right, but even the duty to shape the peace, and as the victor of the Cold War, to guarantee the peace. And very rapidly, very quickly, that evolved into a perspective of American dominance, of hegemony, of exceptionalism, things, by the way, which, in my opinion, were incompatible with peace at the end of the day, which is why we're in the crisis we're in today.
So it's an ideological problem because, I talked on this channel with people like Jack Matlock, Chas Freeman, and several of these brilliant American diplomats and statesmen who were working on negotiating the Cold War to an end. And Jack Matlock, the last US ambassador to the Soviet Union, he keeps saying again and again, we didn't win the Cold War, we negotiated it to an end, and it ended because it was in the interest of both powers, both sides. The collapse of the Soviet Union was, connected to what was happening, but separate. So where is this triumphalism? Where's it coming from? How come that the Europeans had the idea that they and the Americans that they won the war and not the Soviets and the Russians?
It goes back further still to the 1970s, and it's the 1970s that a group of people in the United States began to emerge as a group and to organize and to play an increasingly powerful and influential role within the American government. And they formed in the 1970s, I remember it very well, a group called the Committee for the Present Danger. They took an extremely hard line towards the Soviet Union. They were basically people deeply embittered by the defeat of the United States in Vietnam. And they were very committed, as they saw it, to reversing that defeat. They unsurprisingly had supporters in Congress. They were also extremely adept at consolidating the support for them within, the military industries, the famed military industrial complex, which, by the way, most certainly does exist. They were very well funded. And over time, including in the 1980s, they began to obtain important positions within the United States government. And by the 1990s, this group, which had wanted to pursue a policy, a very aggressive and confrontational policy towards the Soviet Union, found themselves in the beginning of the 1990s in a position to say, well, it was our policies that ultimately were successful. We have been vindicated. We were right. And that shows that any attempt at what they would call appeasement, negotiation, is wrong. What the United States needs to do in every situation is taking the very hard line that we insisted should be taken towards the Soviets. And that should apply to everyone, to China, to India, to Iraq, to Libya, to wherever. Compromise, negotiation, the very thing that people like Matlock and Chas Freeman dedicated their lives to, for them became something unacceptable and tantamount to appeasement. And they developed this view that in terms of the world, you're either with the United States fully or against it. And I think that this is the origins of it. It goes all the way back to the 70s and to the immediate aftermath of the war in Vietnam. I remember those people at the time, people like Richard Pearl, for example, and how dangerous even at that time I thought they were. And it's been very disturbing to track the rise of these people in Washington and in the media ever since.
So is it a generational issue in your opinion? Because the Cold War, in my view, started ending in 1975 as well with the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. That was the beginning of the end of de-escalation. And yes, it went up again, but this was the cornerstone, and this was negotiated by people who themselves grew up in the 50s and 60s, or not grew up, sorry, but who were young in the 50s and got very scared in the 60s and then tried to work toward de-escalation. But that then already had the next generation in the waiting who didn't know all of that and who then became these absolutists, right, in the West. Is it that kind of up and down?
This is exactly what it was. I mean, in the 1940s and 1950s, and especially in the 1950s and early 1960s, people often forget that the Cold War actually intensified in the early 1960s. And the closest we ever got to a nuclear confrontation between the superpowers was in the 1960s over the Berlin crisis in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Anyway, a whole group of people within the US government, within the European governments, within the Soviet Union, became increasingly alarmed that the situation was careering out of control. And from the early 1960s, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, you see a sustained attempt first to ease tensions, the process known as détente. And the culmination of détente, as you absolutely correctly said, in 1975 was the Helsinki Security Conference and the Helsinki Final Act. Now, the other thing which happened in 1975 was that the war in Vietnam ended in defeat. So you see that, and you're quite right, a younger group of people, and they were younger, for them, The big experience, and this is important to say, that in the United States in the 1960s, the late 1960s and early 1970s, in the United States, Vietnam was the all-consuming issue. I mean, détente was being pursued, but the thing that people argued and debated and quarreled about was Vietnam. This other group of people came to the surface at about the same time in 1975, and they said this agreement that was reached in Helsinki is appeasement. It's appeasement of the Soviet Union. It is appeasement of communism, of authoritarianism, and that's why you saw these entities like the Committee for the Present Danger being set up at exactly that time, just a few years after the Cold War ended and the Helsinki Final Act was passed. And it's also the time when, even as attempts are made by both sides to continue the process of détente, you see people like Senator Jackson, for example, heavily involved with the military industries, linking up with these younger people, passing, the Jackson-Vanik, helping to pass the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which undid the attempt to set up commercial and economic links between the Soviet Union and the United States, already pushing back and spreading stories in the media about Soviet perfidy and things of that kind. So, yes, 1975 was a decisive and important year. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the late 70s and the 1980s in the United States were a struggle between a group who wanted to see the Cold War intensified and another group which ultimately was in the ascendant, which wanted to build on the détente process and seek rapprochement with the Soviet Union, and which thankfully in the 1980s largely prevailed. But then these were older people, they departed the scene, the others were still there, and in the early 1990s, they won decisively the battles for control of the American government.
Do you think that, you said the Vietnam War, that the US lost the Vietnam War, had an impact, but my interpretation is always that the US didn't win the Vietnam War, but they didn't lose it. South Vietnam lost it, and that's a completely different story, right? If you really lose a war, you're dead. You hang like Hussein, right? The US never had even one of these experiences. Do you think this plays into this worldview?
Well, you're absolutely correct about this. It was South Vietnam that lost the Vietnam War. And by the way, in the early 1960s, before the United States intervened militarily in Vietnam, this was well understood. You listen, for example, to interviews that President Kennedy was giving in the 1960s. He said very clearly, look, we can help the South Vietnamese, but this is ultimately their war. We can't win it for them. Ultimately, they will win or they will lose. Now, what happened was that the United States allowed itself to become very overcommitted to Vietnam, and it sent troops there. And ultimately, it was not able to prevail on the battlefield, and it pulled out, and South Vietnam lost. Now, it was ultimately South Vietnam's defeat. As you correctly said, the United States did not experience defeat on its own territory. It was not forced to agree to terms. It was a setback for American foreign policy, nothing more. But a country, the United States, which had become the world's dominant superpower relatively recently in the 1940s, that had assumed that its power was so overwhelming that it would always prevail in every situation. There were still some people, some younger people, who found that very difficult to accept, especially as they'd been strong advocates for the war in Vietnam and felt that they'd been betrayed in some way. And of course, they're able to play up precisely on the point that you're making, that the United States has no recent experience of being truly defeated in war. The last time the United States was invaded was in the War of 1812 to 14, long ago. And even that war didn't end in a clear-cut American defeat. So the United States has no real experience or understanding of what true defeat is. It has no real conception that it can be defeated. And this is a massive problem in forming policy because, of course, what hasn't happened in the past can always happen in the future, or at least in a world of nuclear weapons, it can result in catastrophic decisions, which, of course, will not only end the United States, but which potentially could end us all.